Hi, welcome everyone. I would like to thank you all for joining us here today for our webinar on cybersecurity for the natural gas and oil industry, diving into API Standard 1164. I'm Kristen Madler, and I work in USAID's Center for Environment, Energy, and Infrastructure, and I manage USAID's Energy Utility Partnership Program. And today's webinar is organized by the US-Asia Gas Partnership, a public-private partnership between government and industry representatives. And this partnership is designed to both highlight technical topics for regulators, utilities, and policymakers across the region, and to foster business development and networking. Through the partnership, best practice documents, technical standards, safety guidelines, and environmental regulations are shared with partners in emerging LNG importing countries across the Indo-Pacific. And this partnership includes a series of live and recorded webinars featuring leading US and international gas sector experts hosted by USAID's partners, the US Energy Association, and the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners. And USAID, in partnership with USDA, recently conducted a series of webinars on cybersecurity and created the Electricity Sector Cybersecurity and Digitalization Handbook, which may be of interest to this audience as well. The handbook is primarily intended to offer utility staff a go-to overview of the cyber landscape to initiate conversations with utility executives and boards of directors about this ever-evolving industry area. And the information is also relevant to energy sector regulators and government officials. So today's session will provide guidance for managing cyber risk associated with industrial automation and control, and will highlight opportunities to protect critical infrastructure from malicious and potentially disruptive cyber attacks. The expansion of this standard supports the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal for resilient infrastructure, and this updated standard establishes requirements to harden pipeline cybersecurity assets against a range of threats, including those posed by ransomware. It provides enhanced protections at critical connection points along the supply chain, specifically at pipelines, terminals, and refineries. And it also includes improved risk assessment guides, a comprehensive model for implementing pipeline security, and a framework for building out a robust industrial automation control security program. So once again, I would like to thank you all for joining us today. If you haven't done so already, please register for upcoming webinars or listen to pre-recorded webinars at usca.org. In closing, I would like to thank USCA for their efforts to organize today's session and our speakers for carving out time to share your unique perspectives with us today. We greatly appreciate your time and commitment. And next, I would like to give the floor to Sarah Blanford at USCA to introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Kristen. So we have two speakers today. I'll start by introducing the first. Both of these gentlemen serve on API's task force that put together this standard, which, if you read in the overview for this webinar, was a lot of work and long time in the making. So the first gentleman I'd like to introduce is Tom Aubuchon. He's the principal consultant from EthoSecure. Beyond the duties of running his own cybersecurity consulting company, Tom is the co-chair emeritus of the API Standard 1164 update working group that I just mentioned. Currently, he operates in the capacity of technical consultant to the working group. Previously, Tom was chair of the Interstate Natural Gas Association of America's Natural Gas Pipeline Security Guidelines. Tom has over 38 years in OT security, IT security, product development, information technology, and industrial control systems in executive, managerial, consultant, architect, designer, and PM roles. Previously, he was also CISO for a Fortune 100 ONG company responsible for convergence and management of both IT and OT security into a single DT security function. Tom graduated magna cum laude from Oakland University, Rochester, Michigan, and is a certified information security manager. Our second presenter today is James Simons. James is the Infrastructure and Automation Manager, PCD Accountable Manager, Operations Security Manager at Shell Pipeline Company. James leads the company's infrastructure and automation functions, as well as the operational technology and operations physical security programs with over 20 years of experience in pipeline operations and control systems. The responsibility covers the full range of assets operated by Shell Pipeline across the United States and in the Gulf of Mexico. In this role, James has initiated and matured the policies and procedures related to OT security for the business, starting in the Houston Control Center and extending out to operating assets in the field. Further, he has managed assurance process designed to evaluate and improve security outcomes based on risk and as a part of the management lifecycle. In his role as the physical security focal point, he conducts security risk assessments and oversees the maintenance of facility security plans and serves as the primary interface for regulatory bodies. Prior to his current role, James served as an operations supervisor in the Houston Control Center, responsible for the day-to-day remote monitoring and control of several major pipeline systems, responsible for transporting commodity from offshore and onshore locations to key coastal storage assets and refineries. He has also served as a technical support to operations engineers supporting crude, refined product, and chemical systems in South Texas. His initial role in Shell was as an electrical project engineer, completing control system and power projects both onshore and off. Before joining Shell Pipeline, James served as lieutenant commander in the United States Navy and was part of the nuclear power program with assignment to the aircraft carrier fleet upon completion of nuclear power training. He was certified as a naval nuclear engineer in 1999 with follow-on duty as an instructor at the Naval Nuclear Power School. James holds a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering. We are delighted to have both of these gentlemen. I think everyone will agree with me that cybersecurity is one of the hottest topics right now for this sector. And we are absolutely thrilled to have this opportunity to share their expertise with you. So I now pass over the baton to James. Take it away.
Thank you, Sarah. Can you hear me okay?
We can, thank you.
Great, great. Well, again, I'd like to thank everyone for joining the webinar today. The topic is going to be very, very specific and focused on 1164 and its creation. One of the questions that often comes up when we talk about 1164 is why this particular standard? And I think everyone that's familiar with cybersecurity standards in general, there's a litany of them out there today. Some very general in nature, some very high level. The working group that worked this standard over the past 3 years has felt that it was necessary to develop a standard that was specific to pipeline operations. There's a very unique environment, and the standards that existed prior to this we felt didn't really address what needed to be addressed when it came to securing our infrastructure. Tom, if you would. Next slide, please.
Are you seeing my screen?
I see it, yes.
Okay.
There you go. The rationale for change. The question that we want to answer here. So why the standard at this time? As I mentioned, there's a litany of standards that exist around cybersecurity in general. 1164 today is focused very much on pipeline control systems. But before we reached the third edition, the second edition, which has been present in the environment since 2009, in its form, it was not widely adopted by industry. One of the things that we've discovered through our industry participation or our industry groups that we participated in reflected that despite this being out in a published form, many operators didn't adopt it. It was very limited in scope, and when we say that, it was very much focused on SCADA systems themselves and didn't really address the things around the SCADA system, the control system that supported it. And further, during its second affirmation in 2014, there was really not any material change made to it. What that means is it didn't really take a look at the evolving environment around cybersecurity, and thus it didn't really speak to it, which further supported the reason why it wasn't widely adopted. And to build on that a little bit further, we talk about the evolution of vulnerabilities and the threat landscape itself. I think everyone can attest to that the cybersecurity world today, or the cyber threats today, compared to where they were 15 to 20 years ago, it's completely different. And in fact, it changes very, very rapidly. What we discovered, SCADA protection alone does not equal robust defense in-depth strategy. It takes attention given to more than just the SCADA system itself. As I mentioned, the environment around it, the network, the hardware, the systems that are deployed to support this SCADA infrastructure need to be protected as well. So this standard covers the entire control system environment. Beyond just the architecture itself, it also reaches out to stakeholders. It reaches out to supply chain. As a couple of examples of it's extending beyond just technical aspects. It's necessary, we'll feel it's necessary that stakeholders and supply chain participate in an overall cybersecurity program for the pipeline industry. And further to that, the cybersecurity risks themselves require a systematic approach. It's not so much about addressing a particular threat or a particular vulnerability, because as I mentioned, these things evolve over time. So it's necessary to have a program in place that can be measured and can be evolved over time to address the risks as they change. Tom? So a quick overview of the third edition. Okay, first and foremost, it's a complete rewrite of the standard. If you compared the standard as it is today to what it was in 2014 or even 2009, it's completely different. Further, it's based upon industry accepted cybersecurity standards. I mentioned several of those at the start. The Nist control framework, 853, 882, and IEC 62443 were contributors to this document. And again, the material that was gathered from those documents was further refined and focused for the pipeline industry. Secondly, it establishes a management system for advancing that program. As I suggested earlier, the threat landscape and the vulnerabilities are seemingly changing by the month. This seeks to put something in place, a system in place, so that controls can be developed and implemented, they can be measured, and they can be improved upon. And probably one of the most key portions of this standard, which really hasn't been considered up till now, is risk, the assessment of risk and applying your controls. Again, through the participation in this group, we had many number of operators share different perspectives, different technical architectures, and what we found was the risk for one organization wasn't necessarily the same risk for another organization. So this standard in and of itself allows operators to implement a variety of technical controls based upon the risks that they face. Very unique in the standards world today. Okay, that really covers the rationale for why we chose 1164. I'd like to turn it over now to Tom to talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts of the document.
All right, thank you, James.
Mm-hmm.
So now let's go into the creation. I'm going to step back just a little bit and then plow forward. But basically, we want to talk about what we defined the scope to be of this document. It wasn't the no-brainer. There was a lot of debate as to how we were going to proceed from going from the second edition to the third edition. So in March of 2018, here in the U.S., the Transportation Security Administration, the same entity that deals with airplane security and so forth, they also deal with ground to transportation modal, they call it, and pipelines are part of that aspect. And so they actually have regulatory authority over pipelines. And so they have a pipeline security guidelines, and they updated them in March of 2018, and they aligned them to the US National Institute of Standards and Technology cybersecurity framework that was published back in President Obama's administration days. And so they basically have realigned their cybersecurity standard to this Nist framework, and they published it in March of 2018. 2 months later, API convened a group to get together to start talking about, we need to update 1164. It was, as James has pointed out, it was getting a little long in the tooth, if you will, and it needed a different perspective. It was too narrow in scope and so forth. And we needed to align and keep up with TSA guidelines as they came out. And so we needed to figure out what that update was going to look like. And so at what depth and breadth are we going to cover? Are we just going to expand a bit? Are we going to really go deep diving? We knew that we wanted to get beyond just SCADA. We want to do the entire environment. So we're going to do supervisory and local control systems. We have excluded safety systems. Now, we believe this standard very much applies to safety systems, but we make no attempt to determine or adjust your sill levels, right? And so because of that, we say, you can implement this for safety systems, but do it at your own risk, so to speak, right? Everything we say and do is actually applicable to safety systems, but because of the lack of us trying to provide guidance on the sill determination, then we think that it's up to the implementer and reader to go down that path. Now, as James mentioned, we needed to ensure that we included the supply chain. It's not just the owner operator that has the responsibility of securing these systems. The vendor community has to provide systems that allow for security features to be enabled and managed. And so we have to look at the supply chain also, both upstream and downstream, right? It is a shared responsibility in this venue, and so we have to actually engage the entire supply chain and not just focus with our blinders on as it's an owner operator responsibility. We got to have a good management system and everything, but you can't actually get secure products from your vendors. And then lastly, the IIoT space is really starting to get some traction. And so we decided that we did not want to just ignore its existence, but we are also not promoting its use. What we are doing is providing cautions and considerations for those who want to go down the path of IIoT on their pipeline systems. And we provide guidance and cautions and considerations for what you should or shouldn't be doing in that space. But it is not an endorsement of IIoT in any way, shape, or form. It's just that if you're going to be doing this, they need to be playing by the same security rules as your entire control system. Otherwise, it becomes the weakest link in the chain. And lastly, we decided, should this just be a pipeline document? Well, we decided that it would be a pipeline document. 1164 SCADA focus edition 2 was very much a pipeline document. But what we've done, the way we've written this, is that you can kind of ignore the pipeline language. If you were to extract the document and just take out the parts that are pipeline, it's extremely applicable to any oil and gas application. But this is a pipeline control system cybersecurity document. It has in the form of supplemental guidance. It goes into details about what you should be thinking about and what you should be looking at from a pipeline perspective. All right. So as James mentioned about it being measurable and so forth, we had 3 tenets when we started off to build this. I've been doing this for quite a while, and I've done some other guidelines and so forth, as was read off in my bio. And it becomes frustrating to put this level of effort into something like this. And then it just becomes a document that sits on a shelf, collects dust, and occasionally gets brought out and dusted off to show some policy people that, yeah, we do actually have a standard in our industry, and please don't put more regulation on us. But when nobody's really using the document, it was by and large wasted effort. And we said, so if we're going to do this again, we want to A, move the needle, and B, we want to make sure that this thing is actually implementable. So there are no barriers to implementation. It's not too vague. It's not something that, again, it's doesn't give anybody any real teeth or ability to gain traction in this space. So we said it has to be implementable. Security is not a one and done situation. It has to be, so you have to have it has to be a repeatable, and it has to be measurable. And if it's measurable, then it can be improved upon, as James was pointing out earlier. So that measurability piece, if you have the ability to measure the performance of the security environment, you can make adjustments and improvements and mature the environment. So those are the three guiding tenets. And if we ever got stuck in the mud, which we did occasionally, we would use these as our grounding post to pull ourselves back up and say, this is actually what we're trying to accomplish. All the rest of that is noise. We've got to put that stuff to the side. Yes, it's important. Maybe it's a different document. Maybe it'll be addendum later or something, but these are the things we need to focus on. So next, we said, okay, there's a domain of difference between IT and OT. Most folks in security understand that there is a difference. Often they don't understand exactly what that difference is. So people throw out the CIA model versus the AIC model. And you can go down that path, and that does ring true in a lot of situations. But really what it comes down to, at the crux of it at the end of the day, is that in an OT environment, you're trying to protect essential functions, right? And so the health, safety, environment, and availability of the equipment under control is what you're trying to protect. And that safety piece is key and critical, right? So in an IT system, if you're having a cyber incident, isolation, disconnect, shut it down, all of those things are very valid responses. Maybe not the right responses in an OT environment, right? So there's a very fundamental difference in what you're actually trying to accomplish with your security, right? And so at the end of the day, the OT security tenet is that a security measure shall not adversely affect essential functions unless it's supported by risk assessment. For example, number of failed retries to log in. Should it actually lock the person out for 20 minutes? And then they get to try again. And if that happens multiple times, then it locks them out until they get an administrator to reset it for them and so forth. May not be the best approach in an OT environment, especially if there's a panic situation going on, which is why the person's typing in the password incorrectly, and them not, the system blocking them would not be the right approach, right? And so these are the things that you look at when you're developing a standard in the OT space. And again, we put a spin on it, a flavor to it for the pipeline specifics. So if you dig deeper into why is cybersecurity and pipelines so highly important, it really is that security equals safety. Now, in the oil and gas space, especially in the US, and I know in Europe, I've spent quite a bit of time in that space also, safety is first and foremost on everybody's mind. We have safety meetings safety briefings before every meeting. Safety is, they attempt to do zero safety incidences. You get rewarded for zero safety incidences in certain, in a quarter or a half a year or a year. Everything, they have a very mature, very well-supported, well-funded safety program. Security is safety in OT. That exact same mentality, that exact same programs that you have should be adopted for security. And when you actually look at the business objectives of a pipeline and what you're actually trying to protect, the cybersecurity risk you're trying to manage, it's basically human health and safety, environment safety, property safety, operational capability. Now, find an IT system that's where their priorities are. It's hard to do. Now, when you get down to compliance posture and maintain reputation, yes, IT systems have those same business objectives. But that's the big difference between IT and OT is that these essential functions that you're trying to protect ultimately leads to safety. And that's what you're ultimately trying to protect. So safety actually trumps security in these situations. All right, so as we said, TSA mapped to the Nist CSF, okay? We have actually mapped to Nist CSF, thereby addressing TSA guidelines. We did our table of contents follows Nist CSF. It doesn't follow it directly in the identify function because we came up with a different order of precedence we think is more logical. You need to have a governance in place. You need to have a management system in place. Otherwise, you don't have a program that you can mature. So we put that as number one. So we did a little reordering at the top, but every function, category, and subcategory is addressed in 1164. Now, there are a couple items where there are no requirements, and there may just be supplemental guidance, but we have addressed every single item in there. So how did we go about doing this? So if you take the pipeline security guidelines from TSA, you map them to Nist. Nist has these functions, categories, and subcategories. The subcategories are mapped to informative references. There are other standards out there that they map to. They picked, there's COBIT 5, ISA, ISO, IEC 62443, etc. So basically if you go look at those, they're very, I would call it superficial. They don't deep dive into a lot of them, right? So for example, 62443, there's actually going to be 13 documents. There's currently about 7 or 8 documents published. They've only addressed 2 of those documents in informative references. And then they did Nist 853, but they didn't do 882. And 882 is the control system cybersecurity standard from Nist. And so they didn't even map it to their own control system standard. And so what we've done is we've taken the ISA 62443, which is also IEC 62443 on the international scene, and the Nist 853. We've taken those standards as the ones that we're going to leverage to begin with. Now, why would we pick 62443? The main reason we pick 62443 is because it is a full spectrum coverage. Again, it's scheduled to be 13 documents. There's 7 or 8 already published. It covers everything from components of products to products themselves to the implementation of solutions through systems and system integrators implementing those, all the way up into the asset owner management system, wrapper around your cybersecurity program and so forth. So it's all the way from the beginning of manufacturing of your products, all the way to the implementation and life cycle of the use of those products and solutions. And so it actually covers wing to wing, top to bottom of your entire control system space. And so that one was something that we wanted to leverage very heavily. So again, Nist only used 2 of them. I'm sorry, yeah, Nist controls framework only mapped to 2 of the ISA IEC 62443 documents. We contacted ISA and asked them if we could use the documents for reference in the creation of 1164, and they gave us a limited use permission of 6 documents that we were able to leverage to build out the 1164 details. Okay, we then took 853 and 882. NIST 882 is the control system cybersecurity guidelines or cybersecurity standard. But what it does is that it points you back to 853. So it actually says for this particular, we'll just use terminology of NIST cybersecurity framework. For this function, category, and subcategory, you should go look at 853, these sections. And for this one over here in 882, it's going to point you back to this section in 853. So this is cross mapping you have to do. So we actually did that cross mapping of 882 to 853 by using 882 and the informative references of 853 and doing a bidirectional mapping between the two to extract the most value out of the 853 standard to get it into the details of 1164. So all of that content got reworked, looked at from a pipeline perspective, Supplemental guidance was crafted for those particular sections to drive out the value of a standard that is, again, implementable, repeatable, and measurable, so that you can actually have a cybersecurity program based off of this that you can mature over time. All right. So the first thing you need is a management system framework. So as I said earlier, our belief is that if you have a bunch of cybersecurity activities going on, but you actually don't have a management system framework, what you have is ad hoc activities and no program. So I actually had a CIO for a particular company tell me that when I said we don't actually have a cybersecurity program for OT, I was told that was inflammatory language, because to her, buying firewalls was a program. It's like, no, buying firewalls is an activity. It doesn't have a management system wrapper on it. It doesn't have a way to mature it. It doesn't have a way to document what we have. You can't actually audit it against it. It's just a random activity, albeit necessary. Segmenting your IT and OT, highly important, but that in itself is not a program. So the foundation of of implementing this is to actually have a management system wrapper that gives you that ability to mature. Now, the foundation of the management system is the policy. So some policy document, it doesn't have to be a standalone document on itself that says, here's our IAC cybersecurity policy. It could be a section of a grander policy. There's no requirements in 1164 as to how this comes about. It's just that it has to exist. You have to have executive management support of there being an IAC cybersecurity program so that you can get the proper resources applied and spent on this program. Otherwise, it will die on the vine, and you'll end up with a bunch of ad hoc random activities and not a program. All right. Off of that policy, we say you need a plan, and the plan can be one or more documents. And these documents actually tell you what the cybersecurity program is going to be doing. Okay. Now, this is in line with the TSA cybersecurity plan. That guidelines that I mentioned earlier that TSA updated in 2018, all the way back to its first version, it has in there requirements for you need to have a corporate security plan. Part of that corporate security plan is your physical security. Another part of that corporate security plan is your cybersecurity. All right. So their concept, again, is you have to have a management system. You have to have plans for how you're going to manage that system. And so what we've done is follow that same model, because we strongly believe that you have to have an actual management system around your security program, otherwise it's not a program. And so we're following it right along with what TSA says. All right. So if you take your policy that says you have to actually have a program, you then start developing your plans. It includes your procedures, your processes, and your technical and procedural controls. And you document all of that as to A, what are you doing today? And possibly B, what do you want to be doing in the very near future? And then you start interacting with those plans, implementing them, operating the controls that they specify, etc. You start all of your stakeholders. So it's your workforce, your partners, your supply chain are interacting with that security system and parameters. You then take your measurements for the performance of those, and you look for ways to make improvements on them. Those improvements you then take back up to your policy level, because sometimes the improvement requires a tweak to the policy. It doesn't happen often, but it does actually happen. So you always have to go back up to your policy level. From that policy level, you want to prioritize these improvements based on risk of what's going to give you the most value for the resources you're going to spend, and you drive that back down into your program. And so now what you have is an operationalized set of plans, which is the definition of your security program, which has a management system wrapper on it. All right, so this is a plan, do, check, act model. All right, so your plans are all your document, and your program is the use of those documents in the real world. So now, as I said before, the basis of this is the government and management system framework. But ultimately, you need the requirements for what is supposed to be in your program. So what is going to be in the plan? And so there's actually a debate we went through, and we went through this for quite a while. To give you some perspective, we could take on some of these issues, we would take 3 to 6 months to get it ironed out. The whole process to develop this standard was over 3 years. So we spent a lot of time deciding whether we actually do risk-based. Risk is highly important. As James said, ultimately it's got to be at implementation time, it has to be risk-based. But does a standard actually define what that risk is? Or does the standard use impact to select your requirements? So you can actually go and look at calculating a risk score. And this is not to teach you how to do risk calculations and so forth, but you can look at threat factors and you can look at vulnerability factors, and you can come up with a likelihood score. All right. And then you go do the same thing for what is the impact. All right. And so you do that and you come up with an impact score. Right. And so likelihood times the impact equals risk. All right. So then you say, okay, so what does that actually mean? Oops, sorry. So if you go look at a table and you say, okay, I'm going to actually assign words to my impact, I'm going to assign words to my likelihood, you can come up with something like this. Okay, so you have something that's 5, likelihood 5, it's infrequent. It happens infrequently. 6 on likelihood is moderate. 7 is likely, 8 very likely, etc. And then the same thing with impact. Okay. And so in our example before, we came up with the risk score was 42. It was a significant impact and a likelihood of happening. So it's a 42. But what does that mean? So then you use something called a risk strategy to develop your actual risk rating. So a 42 in this example is a medium. It's a medium risk. Okay. The development of that table is company specific. It's not something a standard can really define for anybody. So you're really looking at, okay, the standard can't go down this path because it's really up to the company to decide what those boxes are. Is that box really a high, or is that box really a medium, or maybe that box is a low for some companies? And then in what kind of an asset plays into whether it's high, medium, or low risk. All right. So then you come up with this kind of a table and you say, okay, now what does the risk of medium actually mean? All right. Well, there's 4 different, we've defined there being 4 different risk responses. You can treat the risk, which is the same thing as mitigate the risk, bring it down to an acceptable level. You can terminate the risk. Let's get rid of the asset altogether. Okay. Transfer the risk. Example, let's go get some cyber insurance. Or tolerate. Sometimes, and maybe more often, tolerate is the proper response. Medium is acceptable, and we're just going to tolerate that. But at the end of the day, that decision, risk response, is also up to the company. So what the determination we came to was that in a standard, having bright line rules for risk is not appropriate because it's all driven by the company's own unique situation. So what we're going to do is base it off of the impact. So API already has a well-established standard. It's called Standard 780. It's the Security Risk Assessment Methodology for Petroleum and Petrochemical industries. And in there, they have 5 levels of impact severity. Okay. And it covers health, environment, property, operations, and reputation. We've took that and we boiled it down to 3. We thought 5 was probably too many, and we boiled it down to 3. We figured that, at implementation time, most companies are going to boil that down anyway. You want to get it as simple as possible and still add value. And so we boiled it down to 3. Now, if you look at 62443 for security levels, they have basically 5 levels of security capability for increasing levels of sophistication, increasing levels of motivation, and increasing levels of resourced adversaries. All right. And you want to match those 2 up. The more impactful an event could be, the more protection you want to have against a more advanced threat. Okay, and so we've actually mapped all of the objectives to threat protection objectives to ultimately API profiles. And so all of our requirements fall into one of three buckets of a baseline requirement, an enhanced requirement, or extended requirement. So this is a highly dense slide, but think of it in terms of halves. You have the left half, and you have the right half, and you have the top half, and you have the bottom half. In the upper left-hand quadrant, you have the Nist CSF. Everything on the left are documents outside of 1164 that were used to drive and create 1164. Upper left is the Nist CSF. It drove the critical infrastructure scope of 1164 and the high-level cybersecurity program capabilities, right, in the form of functions, categories, and subcategories. You look at the lower left, that's a 6443 and the 882, 853 pair. Those drove content requirement details in 1164, all of which fall in one of three buckets. Okay, so on the right-hand side is the 1164. It is a combination and a culmination of Nist CSF, ISA 6443, and Nist 882, all rolled up in the context of pipelines. All right, so we created this document over 3 years. There was over 50 companies were involved. We had 3 trade organizations involved, API, INGA, and AGA. We had 3 government agencies sitting in with us. This was developed as an open standard using the ANSII standards process, which requires that anybody who has an interest, an actual interest in the standard can participate in the creation of the standard. And so we had it was highly collaborative. There was over 2,000 hours or 20,000 hours, man hours were put into the creation of the standard and so forth. And then we went to ballot at the first quarter of this year. Okay, and we passed. Large majority passed, right? Well over the bar of the requirements for passing. All right, but there were comments. And so we have to go back and address the comments. And so the comments fell into these different focus areas. Right? There was a scope problem. There was either too much scope or too little scope. The requirements were too strict or stringent to be implemented, or the rigor was inappropriate for the bucket it was in. It was unclear. There's clarity issues. The comment really wasn't actionable. It was a general comment, and there was nothing you could really do about it, or there was grammar, spelling, punctuation, and so forth. And we went and addressed all of those in about a 2-month time frame, and we accepted either in principle or verbatim 54% of the comments. So over half the comments drove another additional change in the standard. It became a better standard because of this change. 14% were noted for potential future changes, and 32 were not accepted. 32% was not accepted, but it doesn't mean no change was made. Often the comment was around a misconception or a misunderstanding, which meant that we weren't actually clear. The reader and the commenter did not understand and made a comment that we couldn't make a change for what they were asking for, but what it did was highlight the fact that we weren't very clear in that space for that particular reader. So that actually drove clarity changes in the standard, again, making the standard better. So again, security is not a one and done. So you need to be able to mature your security program, and the 1164 standard itself needs the ability to be matured over time. So we have this model in the standard that gives you kind of a roadmap on how to implement the standard. And it's basically, there's 5 steps, which basically take you through the segregation of your IT, your OT network from your IT network, doing your impact assessments, selecting requirements, tailoring those requirements for your own specific implementation and your own specific risk profile, and then looping back around on step 5, doing a maturity step upgrade, right? And looking at improving your program. So this is a plan, do, check, act model, again, built into the standard to help folks continually mature and improve their cybersecurity environment. So if you look at the plan, do, check, act, we have this in an addendum. We've actually have mapped it to the Nist CSF functions: identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. We've actually tell you how those steps actually get performed in the plan, do, check, act model. And if you remember, that is just another representation of what we already have in the standard as your management framework, management system framework on how to drive change and improvement in your standard. All right, so on the 1164, how are we going to keep improving 1164? The normal cycle, the typical cycle of an API standard is around 5 years. They'll bring it up unless something significant happens that's in the domain of that standard. Let's say new government regulation comes out that requires API to make an adjustment in their standard. Then it may be faster than 5 years, but typically it's 5 years. They'll look at the standard. And as James mentioned earlier, edition 2 was reaffirmed after a while. That basically no changes were made. They just said, yeah, it's fine. We looked at it, it's fine. All right. What we're going to do with this standard, because the threat landscape is changing so dynamically, and cybersecurity is one of the fastest changing environments out there, that we're going to put it into what's called a continuous maintenance cycle process. And basically what that means is that there will be a constant collection of comments that will be looked at in chunks and in blocks. There will be meetings set up. We'll go do reviews of the comments. We'll sort those comments. We'll try to figure out how to best address those comments. We will make updates. It will go through a bouting process, and we will issue addenda to the standard for those changes. And that's going to be on a continuous basis, right? So it's not going to be on any 5-year cycle, because we've got to get keep up with the ever-changing landscape. So in a nutshell, that's the API 1164 standard. It took, again, 3 years. I had originally there was a slide that I bulleted all this out. We can certainly publish that as to the level of effort that occurred in those 3 years, the amount of individuals involved and so forth. But as mentioned earlier, this was 3 trades that were involved. AGA, INGA, and API partnered on this from the very beginning and brought in all of their members into the conversation, which is why it was such a large contingency of folks that came in and sat in on this thing for 3 years. And so a special thanks goes out to those 2 organizations from API to help ensure that this is a widely adoptable standard across the entire pipeline sector. So with that, we are in the question and answer period.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, James. That was great. I put a note on if anybody has any questions. We have a few minutes left. You can post them into the Q&A. While people are thinking through that, I had a couple questions I was hoping I could pose to you, gentlemen. A lot of, if you looked at the participant list, we have a number of colleagues from other countries that are joining us this evening. For a country in the very first stages of addressing cybersecurity in their oil and gas sector, are there areas of the standard that you would recommend they make their first priority, or is it just that they make a cybersecurity program to begin with?
Yeah, so James can definitely follow up here. So from my perspective, and I said it about 20 times probably in the presentation, you have to start with a policy that comes from executives in the organization that authorize you to have a program that will give you proper resourcing. And from that, you actually start documenting the higher level items that you need. And it's kind of a hierarchical model, but in consider it, also like building a house, you got to have the foundation in first before you start putting up the frame. You've got to have those foundational elements in first. All right. And you don't have to do, it's not a giant, implement things for 5 years, or work on things for 5 years, and then you throw a big switch and it's implemented. You roll it out in phases and pieces as quickly as you can. Right. And you just keep building on it and look at what's the next highest risk that I have out there. Let's address that. What's the next highest risk I have out there? Let's address that. And you just keep on that maturity model. James, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I do. Thanks, Tom. It's a very difficult question to answer because much as we described in the discussion, you know, the environment, the risks associated with different owner operators, regardless of where you are in the world, it varies. The thing that is fundamental, as Tom described, is you've got to have that set of policies and then that program that's built. One thing that folks need to understand is you're not going to be necessarily 100% on your first iteration. You have to be strong enough in your foundation and then bold enough to move forward through the different phases of the execution that's described in 1164 to get to a certain spot, and then you evaluate and then you return to the beginning. And the expectation, I would say, which is certainly realistic, is that each iteration of that cycle is going to improve you. But if there's anything to say that's the most important thing is to get started now.
Thank you, James, and Tom. We have a question in the Q&A box. The gentleman, I'll just read it out in case you're not seeing the screen. Can you help describe briefly how this standard is going to impact vendors of various emergency shutdown system in the market already implemented on assets owned by U.S. oil and gas companies? Tom or James, could you address that?
Yeah, that's and Tom, you can certainly add in if you have some thoughts. With regards to specific functions that a control system might be responsible for, in this case, an ESD, the leverage that 1164 puts in place in that environment is again impacting or securing the environment in which that ESD is supposed to behave. It's not so much that the ESD function in itself will be improved. It will be that essential function, as Tom described earlier, will be better protected. As far as vendors, the equipment and the hardware that they use maybe to package a solution of that nature would certainly expect to have improved thresholds of robustness, of protocol use, whatever the case may be, that would lend itself to a secure environment versus necessarily being so open and convenient that it runs the risk of being compromised. Tom?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there, James. At any given essential function, the role of the standard is to ensure that the proper protections are there to protect that essential function so that it is available when needed, right? And so if it's ESD as the essential function that we're protecting, the security standard itself is not going to impact how well the ESD functions when the ESD functions. It's going to ensure that the ESD function is available when the ESD function needs to be available. It hasn't been compromised. Now, as to how it impacts the vendors, I'm not sure I completely understand the premise of that question. I don't see an impact directly to the vendors unless they are not, there's some security features that they are lacking that they would need to put in to protect that essential function. Then maybe there's a hook there for them.
All right, thank you. The next question in the Q&A is certification of devices addressed such as ISA, secure, UL, TUV, etc.
Sorry, say that again.
Yeah, it's The question is certification of devices addressed in the standard, such as ISA secure, UL, TUV, etc.?
So no, it is not. Again, ISA secure, the certifications for devices and certifications for the systems are based off 62443, and you can get certified in those. Our standard is based off of 62443, but there is not a mapping of those secure certifications to the standard directly. So I know ISA secure on the robustness side, it involves packet insertions and so forth, using devices to do packet insertions onto the network to see if you can knock over the device and things of that nature. And getting all that certified at the device level, and then doing certifications on the system integration level, solution level, is another certification you get with ISA secure. And again, 1164, if you're implementing 1164, you're almost there. You know, there's a few I's to dot and T's to cross as far as the documentation trail, as evidentiary artifacts of your program that you need to make sure you have in place. Now, as far as UL, my involvement with UL is limited in dealing with electrical devices and so forth, and power surges and things of that nature. So I can't really speak to that one.
Okay, thank you. Another question. What, in your opinion, are the biggest issues facing the sector as it pertains to cybersecurity? This isn't, I know it wasn't a needs assessment, but just from your experience on the subject matter.
Tom, I'll go first on this one.
Sure.
The probably from my perspective, I mean, there's probably a litany of things that we can identify that continue to challenge our control system environments, but certainly organizationally speaking, there's this idea or this concept that threats can be addressed very pointedly, and then you can turn and walk away. And then you can say to yourself or to your organization, we fixed this problem, let's move on to operations. For most owner operators, if not virtually all, you know, their control systems are their bread and butter for executing their business. In managing and maintaining those things, whether it's cybersecurity related or not, is critical. In my experience, and of course that's because this area is relatively new. Certainly over the past 15 to 20 years, it's evolved. It seems to me that industry seems to think that it's, again, it's you have this one particular problem, this one particular vulnerability, you patch it or you install a firewall, as Tom suggested earlier, and the problem is solved. And it's not sufficient in order to sustain these control systems in the world today. So probably one of the biggest challenges that I see is this I don't know if apathy may be a bit of a strong word, but it's certainly this concept that it's not something that continually needs to be managed. And again, that's one of the things that 1164 very much tries to address. Tom?
Yeah, I'll just add on to that. I completely agree with what you said. I think some of it comes down to an unwillingness to change to the actual situation that's at hand. People still believe that, you know, my system's air gapped enough, we'll call it, you know, that we're segregated enough. We keep IT at a distance and so forth. And they think that they can operate their control system like they did in the 80s and in the 90s, because they have equipment that came from the 80s and the 90s, right? And so to me, you've got to start, and unfortunately, it takes cyber incidents in the space to get people's attention, right? So if you have a bridge without a guardrail and a car drives off the bridge, they put up a guardrail. Well, you can't do that. You can't wait for the incident to occur to start protecting for that incident, right? So you got to have a mindset, like I said at the very beginning, a security mindset like you have in the safety space, right? And if you can get, that's where the industry is lacking, super focused on safety. That is super important, but there just isn't the focus on the control systems, cybersecurity as a whole. And I'll tell you that some organizations aren't going to do anything until the regulation. And that's unfortunate because there are so many players in the space who go way above any place where a regulation will go, right? And I'll speak for Shell. James won't speak for Shell. I'll speak for Shell. There are the cream of the crop, along with others that go above and beyond. And James's organization is probably well into doing everything that the standard already says you should be doing before the standard was ever written, right? And there are organizations that do that. And then there's the other end of the spectrum where they have one guy part-time who deals with some aspect of security, cybersecurity. And to them, they think they're staffed up properly. And that world doesn't exist anymore, right? The threat landscape we have seen from trying to monetize, folks trying to, adversaries trying to monetize these security threats is where they're coming from these days. It's not necessarily nation states that are trying to take down your control system to do damage to your country, although there can be some of that. Most of the threat is coming from there's an ability to actually monetize it, right? And there are so many adversaries out there willing to do that. The control systems now have become a point of focus for this threat. They've just, in some cases by accident, have come across this, the adversaries have, and they kind of realized, hey, wow, there's money to be made here, right? And it's time for the industry to change their attitude about this. They're no longer in the, in the shadows. The control system is no longer in the shadows from a cyber adversary's perspective.
All right. Well, thank you, Tom, and thank you, James. I think the mere fact that we had this webinar is speaking to the issue, and that awareness from what you said is one of the biggest issues. So hopefully the attendees from today and those that register that will be receiving a copy of this webinar later can do what they can to get the word out and make everyone more sensitive to this issue and to get ready to take action. So we thank you very much, and we thank API for helping us coordinate this. We really enjoyed the expertise shared by Tom and James, and thank you all of the attendees, both from the US and from other countries. We're really glad that you could join us, and we hope that you will check out the USDA website for more webinars on this topic and others that pertain to the sector. So thank you, everyone. Good evening and good morning, and have a good day. Thank you.